Shalom. So,
Shalom back.
Guy, I'm talking to Guy from the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, who's had a very interesting life and lots of diverse um, experiences, and we've had some interesting discussions and back and forth. And I thought it would be nice to just have a conversation. And we had some possible topics of discussion. So, uh, wherever you want to start.
Okay. I think that one of the things that I wanted, we were talking about, you were talking about your experiences in Jewish meetings where there'd been ecstatic experience. Maybe it wasn't even a meeting. Maybe you had some sort of ecstatic experience separately to that. And I've met Lubavitchers, and I've met sort of all different kinds of Jewish people. I've watched programs about it on TV as well, and it's a point of interest. My church is really into Israel, which I know is a favorite non-topic of yours. and I'm not. My experience is that I went to Israel twice. I've been to Israel. The first time I went to Israel, I was very much a Christian Zionist. I was very enthusiastic. I went to international Christian thing, and sorry, it's just leading off a completely different direction in some ways. And then I went and stayed with a friend who I'd met at university who was from the Gaza Strip. And this was during Operation Peace for Galilee, which is when they kicked the PLO out of Lebanon and massacred people in camps and things. So it was a very sort of stress moment. So I'd been involved very much with the Jewish group at university before that, and been quite interested. And I knew that once they get going on a Friday night, once they'd sung that wonderful hymn to the Queen of the Sabbath, which has always worried me anyway, you know, the dancing and everything else in the drink, and there was an intentional working yourself up towards some sort of spiritual experience on the Sabbath. How did that work out for you? Because you came from a very similar, and it wasn't Lubavitcher, there wasn't it? It was some sort of.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
You were Lubavitcher, okay.
So to explain to people, Lubavitch, or Chabad as it's more commonly known, is a dynasty within the Hasidic movement. And the Hasidic movement is only about 300 years old. That's something a lot of people are not aware of. And so what happened was that the founder of Hasidism, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, had one main student and some more minor students, and that student had many students. And after the Maggid, who was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov, died, each of his students went and set up a court in different places in basically Eastern Europe. And Hasidic dynasties are generally known by the city where that court was. Chabad ended up in the city of Lubavitch in Russia. And curiously, Chabad is one of the few Hasidic dynasties that is also known by a different name other than the city that it's from, which is Chabad. And Chabad comes from it's an acronym of some Kabbalistic concepts. We don't. I mean, we can go into that if you would like.
That's just like level too deep, I think.
What do you mean by ecstatic?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I'm obviously a charismatic Christian. I speak in tongues, but I've also had moments when I have been compelled by the Spirit to speak, for example, to say something that was, in fact, prophetic. I would definitely call it that. I have had experiences when the Toronto Blessing was around. We missed the Toronto Blessing. We were elsewhere in the world, and so we missed that one out to a large extent. But I went to meetings at the very end of the Toronto Blessing time.
What is the Toronto Blessing?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? Toronto Blessing was a Christian movement in the mid-90s. Started off in Toronto, surprisingly. So like Lubavitch, Toronto, here we go. It's all the same stuff. There had been a movement in the 70s, 80s, based out of Anaheim, California, under a guy called John Wimber, and that had a plant church in Toronto, and suddenly people started being moved by the Spirit in ways that they would fall on the floor. They would speak ecstatically, or a lot of people just fell on the floor, and that was it for 2 hours. And 2 hours later, they get up, and God had changed them in ways they couldn't explain. Lots of habits forming, things. Interesting, in considering that the modern thing is Bethel, and Bethel's emphasis is healing. The Toronto thing was very much meeting with God and being energized to do God's work, which was quite an interesting difference.
So
of feel. So yes, yes. So whether it's lying on the floor, or whether it's just knowing the presence of God in a much realer way than you'd normally do in your normal life, to the point where things don't really mean anything other than that.
So part of what has made Hasidism so attractive, and I mean, it has really caught through Judaism like wildfire, to the point where for a lot of people, the term Hasidic actually pretty much means the most religious of Jews. And part of that was because the Baal Shem Tov and his students very much were very focused on a personal encounter with God.
Yes.
And Jewish mysticism, and in fact, were disseminated. So part of what allowed the Hasidic movement to start was the fact that there was a sort of elitism in Judaism, where the top rabbis might have a strong spiritual life, but the general population were somewhat ignored spiritually, and the Baal Shem Tov and his students were very much into. I mean, it was a popular movement. It was a populist movement, and it certainly did include personal meditation. There are a lot of stories about the Baal Shem Tov and his students encountering the miraculous, encountering heavenly revelation. The Baal Shem Tov was actually an itinerant healer. So that was certainly part of it. And so when we talk about Chabad, Hasidism, there is a concept of the tzaddik, the righteous person in Hasidic philosophy, and this righteous person is considered very much, I mean, as a leader and as an opportunity for people who may not themselves be able to constantly be engaged with the divine, to encounter that by extension. So
can I suggest, so in Islam, sorry, my Islamic knowledge is probably greater than my Jewish knowledge, although I know enough, I think, to keep going. Saints, the pir, um, actually has far more righteousness than they need, because they believe in a weighing in the scales.
Mm.
So they have so much righteousness that even when they die, their tombs exude it. And other Sadiq like like that. You know, they have so much righteousness in them that they exude it to people around them, and therefore to be near them and to listen to them is actually to attain to gain some form of blessing off them.
I would say that there's a similar idea that that Tzaddik is a conduit by which spirituality um, extends itself, becomes in a sense incarnate, right? Because we as human beings are supposed to be the image of God, and there is this concept. It's actually called the chariot. So there is an idea within Jewish mysticism that a person who negates themselves to the divine will, right?
Yes.
That their will becomes nullified to the will of God, in a sense, becomes like a chariot that is being ridden by godliness, right? So the person becomes nullified, becomes a vehicle and a vessel, right? That they themselves become, literally the word is bitul, is nullified. That
Right.
and what that person does, and you know, so the Rebbe, who was the most recent leader of Chabad, died in 1994. I only became religious. I mean, I was becoming religious in that time, but I was not aware really of Chabad back then until after the Rebbe died. When I went off I went off to college in 1995. I started um, somewhat having some connection with Chabad. And unfortunately, since the Rebbe's passing, there has not been another Rebbe. There has not been a successor.
How did that happen? Because the Rebbe must have been in his 90s. He must have had people who followed him, but no one was valid.
So unfortunately, the Rebbe had no children,
Right.
and he became Rebbe in 1954, I want to say. So almost all Hasidim did not know any Rebbe from before the Rebbe.
Yes.
Chabad was much smaller before the Rebbe, and he grew it
Yeah.
in exponential fashion. Especially, it was right after World War II. He had come to the United States, where there was not much Orthodox Jewish life, and again, like wildfire, his teachings had spread. For example, Hanukkah, believe it or not,
Yeah.
was not really considered a very prominent holiday in Judaism at all. Um, in many circles, it still isn't. I mean, in Israel, it's a lot less prominent than the other holidays, and a lot less prominent than it is in the United States. Part of the prominence of Hanukkah actually came through the Rebbe's efforts.
Right.
And so he was based out of New York, and um, there was a lot of messianic fervor. Pretty much everybody, Chabad or not, that I know of who met the Rebbe or knew of the Rebbe, with few exceptions, say if there was one person in that generation who was going to be the Messiah, it was the Rebbe. It was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And honestly, I know a lot of Chabad Hasidim who they're still I mean, the grief for the Rebbe, the anniversary of his death was just a little bit over a month ago. And it's a story that's become almost cliche in Judaism. Somebody comes along who is so charismatic and inspiring that at least a segment of the Jewish community becomes convinced that he is the Messiah. And when he dies, they can't process it. Part of my falling out with Chabad is that I think a Hasidic movement, there's only one other Hasidic dynasty that had a similar thing happen, where the Rebbe died and there was no successor. That's Breslov. And
Okay. That was because of the war, if I remember rightly.
No. The Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, he died without a child, but that he was actually a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. So,
direct link.
Yeah. So he was actually the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov through his daughter. And when he died, Breslov has had other leaders, but they never considered that leader a tzaddik, to have that role of a Hasidic tzaddik, of a Hasidic leader. And so I personally hope that at some point Lubavitch will I believe has to come to its senses and realize that that Hasidism does not function without a living, talking, breathing Rebbe who you can go and talk to, but yeah, it's been since 1994. So what is that? 26 years almost?
Yeah.
And
so lots of institutional momentum tucked away inside the Lubavitcher.
And I mean, there are people who say, look, the Chabad is constantly growing, and it is. And Chabad is doing wonderful work, and it is. But again, I don't think Hasidism works without a living Rebbe to lead you. There were really no candidates. It's somebody has to come forward who has that charisma, and that people can sincerely believe that this person, like the Rebbe, is nullified to the will of God. And honestly, it's just, the answer I get is, well, who's your candidate? And I have none.
No, it's so sad. I mean, it's you're trying to create a dynasty, you're trying to create a spiritual dynasty, and getting to the second, third generation, and then not being able to pass it on. The torch is sort of, talking about Hanukkah, of course, that the flame, someone rather that will.
the Rebbe was actually the 9th leader in a line from the Baal Shem Tov. So, and honestly, watching videos, I don't know if the fact that there are so many videos and so much of his writings, I don't think it's really comprehensible to somebody who hasn't been an Orthodox Jew to realize the relevance of what I'm saying. But the Rebbe came up with 600 what are called chidushim, which are new questions on Chumash Rashi, on a very basic understanding of
600 or 613, because 613 is quite a significant number.
Well, honestly, I mean, it's between 600 and 800, that he, for almost 4 years straight, every Sabbath, he gave forth a discourse. So one of the greatest intellectual accomplishments in Judaism is to think up a new question, right?
Yes, because
Like,
they should, because you've had 2,000 years to ask them all already.
right. And so the Rebbe had these new questions and explanations on Chumash Rashi, which is just the 5 books of Moses the with the commentary of Rashi, which is considered child level. Like, this is the basic commentary that every, when a 9-year-old starts learning Chumash, they learn it with Rashi.
Yeah.
And I mean, his genius was incredible. That honestly, I think he was oftentimes prophetic. I think you can see that in so many ways. And it's just been impossible, certainly among Chabad Hasidim, to say somebody is going to be his successor.
A less immortal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about this chariot word? That's really interesting. So I'm going to go slightly off to one side here. So in the book of Ezekiel, which is one of my favorite books of the Bible.
That is exactly the chariot we're talking about.
Okay, so that is the link.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So
it's interesting that Christians don't know Ezekiel at all, generally. And I did a study on it. Do you read the Bible every year or something like that? Obviously, as an Orthodox Jew, you read the 5 books of the Bible. That
right.
Fairly standard.
The rest of the Bible doesn't actually tends to get very short shrift among Orthodox Jews. That there is, so
there's not even a secondary reading list, is there? It's not like this is the core thing you must read, and if you want to, you can read the rest of it in a year as well. But
well, it is considered. So honestly, it's become, and certainly through the work of a certain woman, Nechama Leibowitz, she actually basically reinvigorated the study of the rest of the Bible. It's very funny. She never held any office in any way. She was a professor, and she just told everybody to call her teacher and the Mora, right?
Yeah.
And she was almost universally accepted, even in the most ultra Orthodox circles, where generally women are just, in some circles, it's actually very backwards. Their view towards women.
I've been in Christian sects like that.
Yeah. So her capacity to teach, especially Nach, right, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the other 19 books of the Bible, as we count them, other than the 5 books of Moses, certainly has reinvigorated the fact that people are speaking Hebrew as a first language, has definitely reinvigorated the study of Nach. So there's certainly a lot more attention paid to the rest of Nach. And partially it's because of the availability of books. I mean,
the synagogue no longer can just afford the 5 scrolls; they can afford the rest of it in bulk as well.
I think many people don't really realize, as I think the two of us kind of, we're a bit older than many of the people on the Bridges of Meaning, and I think how life went about 20, even just 20, but certainly 30, 40 years ago is just so shocking to a lot of people. Now if we want to look at a text It's right
Just
there.
Google it.
Especially an ancient text. I mean, the availability, just going to the library, I remember was a huge treat when I was a child, right? It was, who had books? How many books did you have? The number of books people have these days is actually quite, so, and the quality of printing. You look at the Hebrew books that were printed just 30, 40 years ago. Some of them were just of such poor quality, it was almost impossible to read them. So yes, I mean, there's certainly been a revitalization of the study of Nach, especially because of because just so many more people now can read Hebrew for themselves. And yes, it is an expectation. I found this website. There are some websites that say some really amazing things. And one of them,
in all sorts of ways.
yeah, and one of them said, like the Talmud says, you must not study the Bible. I don't even know what they misunderstood.
Where did they get that
right?
from?
I can't
Which
even
phrase.
I can't even find what they are misunderstanding to mean such a thing. Oftentimes I can actually at least trace where that comes from to some extent.
Yeah.
I still haven't been able to source where that idea is so but yeah, I mean, it's not like it is somehow prohibited in any way or even discouraged or not encouraged. It is encouraged. But I mean, anybody who seriously looks at education, religious education, realizes that, most people are not going to sit there and read through pages and pages of Ezekiel telling you the dimensions of the third temple, which I think might be part of the reason Christians kind of stay away from Ezekiel.
I think there's two things about Ezekiel. One is that third temple bit is all a bit weird because, of course, it never really happened.
It will
yet happened. Exactly. Exactly.
It will, but that's not many Christians believe it will.
Or maybe it already exists and it's the heavenly one mentioned in the book of Hebrews, which
so that's,
apparently you allow.
That's one of the interesting things that I've found is that sometimes, obviously, the Talmud wasn't finalized until about 500 years after Jesus. And so sometimes you find these ideas in the Talmud, which I can't give an earlier source for. And one of them is this concept of the temple not built by hands. So when I was reading Hebrews, it was like, this is and it is the oldest source we have for this Jewish belief, which certainly the Talmud takes as everybody knows about the temple not built by hands. And I'm very careful not to cite, as much as I can avoid it, not to cite Talmudic ideas which don't have an obvious basis in the Tanakh, because a lot of Christians have this, it's the leavening of the Pharisees and the
scriptura.
Right. And so it's actually part of what has been very interesting for me in the past year, has been the capacity to now use the Greek Bible to kind of flip a lot of tables on Christians. So on my Discord server, we were discussing a video by Chosen People Ministries. I'm not sure if you've heard of them.
But there's lots of them around.
There are, but these are somewhat well known. They specifically try to evangelize Jews.
So it's Jews for Jesus modern day. version.
Yeah, except they're far more, I would say, I am very loath to throw around charges of anti-Semitism. There is certainly a strand of anti-Semitism in their brand of evangelization. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And so they had this video where they were debating the oral law, and they had found probably one of the least qualified rabbis they could, who had a nice long beard and looked the part, and and honestly, half of the stuff he said was so cringe I couldn't even listen to it. But my whole reaction was, well, this debate, if this rabbi had known the Christian Bible well enough, he could have blown them apart with things from the Christian Bible that these people could not. And it's that was one of the most surprising parts to me of delving into the Greek Bible by myself, is finding a lot more Judaism there than I ever expected. There is definitely a lot more Judaism contained within the Greek Bible. I've heard people say this, and I realize it seems insulting, and I don't mean it to be insulting. I really don't know how Christians understand their own Bible, since they don't understand our Bible, and that is a very key component to so much of the Christian Bible, that it seems to me, and people tell me I'm being haughty, and it's hubris, and overconfidence, and look, I certainly am not the most humble person on earth, but honestly, a lot of times I feel like Christians simply don't have the background to understand their own Bible.
I think that's fair. I think that it's really interesting with, I've got, what, 8 inches, maybe 10 inches of N.T. Wright on my bookshelf, okay. Which I've read, and the people of the Old Testament. I went to Bible college for 2 years, but the Old Testament guys who really knew their Hebrew, I learned the Hebrew letters, I learned a few basics. I don't know enough to actually even put Hebrew grammar together, so don't quote me on that one. But I think that the people who do and understand, and it's interesting with N.T. Wright especially, perhaps, is to understand the culture of the Jewish community in the first century. Because like you said, Talmud wasn't finished until 500, 600. Maybe even Maimonides himself finished it in the year 1000-ish. But it was a developing system still. And so we have a slice through it at the time of Jesus. Yeah. And there were, even within Judaism, that you don't see Sadducees after AD 70 because the system disappeared. Right. It's really interesting to know that. And I think one of the things for me is I took my Bible study group through Ezekiel, and not the temple bit, interestingly enough. I left that off. But actually the bit, I don't know if you remember this, but where he's grabbed by his hair in the spirit and taken to Jerusalem.
I don't remember.
It's an amazing passage. He's taken to Jerusalem from the river. It's just before the Jerusalem falls. He gets to Jerusalem. He gets dropped in. He's a priest, of course, so he's a Kohen of some sort, or a Levite. And he gets dropped in the temple, and God says to him, "What do you see?" And he says, "Well, it looks like it's your temple, but your Shekinah is there. Your glory is there, and the chariot is there." And then the men go around marking people with a towel on their heads, which of course could be thought of as a sign of the cross. All those who are righteous left in the city, and those who aren't righteous get killed.
Mm.
And then he gets told to dig through a wall, which he does, and it's like it's like a CGI basically. Digs through the wall, and on the inside, all the high priests are there in a room filled with idols. And then he goes through one of the gates, and they're worshipping the fertility goddess by beating themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then he finally arrives at the evening sacrifice, the morning sacrifice, and people, all the high priests, turn their back to the Shekinah, which is still there, and worship the sun directly.
So I definitely have to look this up. Honestly, the visions of Ezekiel are considered very advanced things that are oftentimes,
wheels within wheels, all that sort of stuff. It's completely mind-blowing.
Yeah. And I don't know if you ever listened to me trying to go through some of the chapters of the Bible with the Hebrew, but
we have a study group in our church. We have about 5 groups, all of whom work through a rabbinic 5-year cycle. So yeah, be available to that.
So I oftentimes find myself incapable of translating to English sentences that I may know every single word of. Just because you know every single word and you know how it hangs together doesn't mean that you necessarily know how to express that. There are some people will say, if you don't know how to teach it, you don't understand it. And to me, I have to wonder, because the frustration of knowing something which you don't know how to express is very, very real. Right now I'm reading through Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary, and very, very interesting book. It's hard to get through, but incredibly interesting book. And part of what he talks about is the right brain, left brain. I mean, that is the essence of, the dichotomous brain, the ways of thinking of the
right. That's McGilchrist's arguments, yeah.
And the right brain can in fact be frustrated in expressing itself because language resides in the left brain. And sometimes I think, imagery can express ideas because they are more right brain ideas. They are more relational ideas as opposed to particular ideas. Honestly, I'm still trying to digest his book. It is a very, very interesting book, and I've only got I just started the second half, where he's now. I mean, this is where he goes. The first half, he says, in the first half I'm going to be very scientific, and in the second half I'm going to be very speculative, and he's being very speculative, and I think we need that, but there's a lot of things I have to think through for that book. I highly recommend it.
But that was the whole point of the Jordan Peterson thing, was it took us to places we didn't expect to go. And I think, the biblical series, I don't know how you felt about those first 5 books, but they were they shook. Not in the sense of shook in the sense of made me doubt, but shook in the sense of made me want to grow again. There's a tree in Kew Gardens in England that they were going to chop down. It had stopped growing. It didn't look very healthy. It just sat there in the middle of this great big lawn. It was beautiful, but it was dying quietly, and they knew it was dying. And then the storms came along in, I think it was the ones in the 96s, somewhere around there in the middle, anyway. And the whole tree got lifted up by the storm and dropped down again. And it's the most thriving tree you can imagine today, because actually what it needed was a whole lot of oxygen around it, because the lawn was actually taking all the oxygen out of it and stopping any more oxygen getting back in. It just, so by lifting it and dropping it, a whole lot of oxygen got back into the roots and it was happy tree again. And I think that Jordan Peterson did that for me to a certain extent.
Part of the problem I've had listening to both John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson is there is a large percentage of what they say which is repetitive to me, and I just get bored. And part of what I like about the internet is you can get beyond that introductory level in which almost all introductory
Yes.
things start off on. If I'm going to discuss Judaism or Christianity with basically 99.9% of the people I meet, and certainly Jordan Peterson, or any of the ideas that are running around this part of the internet, just getting past the foundations to a point where we're discussing things that are actually fresh and relevant, it's prohibitive.
Yeah, it takes too long. Can I go back? So you still haven't answered my question, and I'm going to ask it in a different way. So the Baal Hashem.
Baal Shem Tov.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Baal Hashem.
Baal Shem Tov.
Baal Shem Tov.
Yeah. Yeah.
So okay, maybe my misunderstanding. My understanding is he was Baal Hashem, the master of the word.
Right. Baal Shem Tov, you can split it up two ways. There, Baal Shem is a term that was used for people who knew holy names and were used and did things like write amulets, which the Baal Shem Tov did write, and he was a Baal Shem.
A master of the word, a master of the name, maybe. Yeah.
And he ended up being called Baal Shem Tov, which you can translate either as the good person who is a Baal Shem, which is probably how it started, or you can say master of the good name, meaning that he was a person who had a good name.
Yeah.
It's funny, because of the intense interest in Hasidism, there's been a lot of study into his life, and they've actually found, the documents of his life, because it wasn't that long ago.
No, it's 1760s, wasn't it?
Something like that. Yeah. I almost want to look it up, because we actually,
interestingly contemporaneous with Whitefield and Wesley.
I don't know who they are.
Okay, so you've heard of Methodist churches?
Yes.
You've heard of the Great Awakening?
Oh, as in Wesleyan?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Huh. The Baal Shem Tov.
Okay, we're gonna do one more.
Oops. So he died.
That was your mother calling.
No, it was a YouTube thing that showed up. It was a tab that was open from because I'm trying. I just opened up the thing. So he died in 1760.
Yeah, that was the number I had in my brain. But Wesley and Whitfield, who the Great Awakening in America,
Mm.
were part of the driving forces for that before around with Jonathan Edwards. They the same era. And what's interesting about that is that you've got the same impulses. The world suddenly, the people of great spirituality suddenly appear across the plane. You know.
But one thing I really like to point out is that lowercase o, Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, and Orthodox Islam all agree on Neoplatonism.
Yeah.
And that is a thread through all of these religions that a lot of people wonder, can we ever come back together? And I quote this all the time, but Maimonides, he says in his most major work, the Mishneh Torah, that the spread of Christianity and Islam make it possible. And again, I'm not saying this to be offensive, but make it possible for when the Messiah comes, for everyone to recognize these ideas within Judaism, which have been spread around the world through Christianity and Islam.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the questions that I didn't bring up at the beginning was the thought that is, I mean, I don't want to be rude to Muslims because I don't think it's fair, but there are definitely Jewish influences and Christian influences in the Quran and actually into Islam. I think they've been to a certain extent masked now, but I think to me anyway, and I think generally the historians, if you ask them, would say that actually if you wanted to say it's a cult of Judaism would be the word that you would use rather than Christianity, interestingly enough.
So Robert Eisenman, he is somewhat fringe, but he is a respected academic, a respected fringe academic. He was one of the preeminent scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. Okay.
And he originally he studied Islam. Originally, his PhD was in Islamic studies. And so he dates the Dead Sea Scrolls very late. He believes that they actually date to around the destruction of the temple around year 70. That's about 100, almost 200 years after most academics date the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay.
And he believes that the Qumran community was actually the Christian community of James, the brother of Jesus. And that's the name of his book, his latest book, James, the brother of Jesus. And he believes that the Ebionites, who disappeared around the year 500, were the Jews that were mentioned in the Quran. So he believes that what scholars call Jewish Christianity, as opposed to Pauline Christianity, was taken by Muhammad and his group and turned into Islam.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's. He'd have to be pretty forceful in arguing that one to me. I think. Certainly there were Jewish people who had adopted Judaism or were influenced by Judaism and have formed Jewish tribes, and because they're recognized in the Quran itself. I think the other thing for me is that this is one of my sort of more aggressive things I say is that of course all the Jews today were refuseniks from the beginning, in the sense that most Jews who in fact, all the Jews who became Christian eventually merged into the generalized Middle Eastern population. Was the rest of them were Christian pre-Islam anyway. You only, by the end of the 600s, the beginning of the 600s, you either were Jewish or you were Christian.
Right. So yeah, I mean,
which is an interesting one.
There-
Can we ignore that
Okay.
little thing? That was just for fun. Going back to this Baal Shem Tov.
Yeah.
And so he writes amulets. My understanding is he was capable of casting demons out of people.
I believe so, yes. So this whole thing of speaking in tongues is actually very, I'm still trying to understand it, because from a Jewish standpoint, obviously just the fact that something is what would be termed supernatural doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from a good source.
Yes.
And so there, I mean, I certainly there are the concepts of demons and that type of thing. Dybbuk, right? The word dybbuk,
yeah,
is actually Hebrew. And yeah, it's so what is spiritually going on there? It's yeah, the Baal Shem Tov was certainly, so his writings describe his travels into the higher realms.
right.
He certainly, I mean, so one of the things that, and Muslims say the same thing about the Hadith. What they say in Hasidim say is, if you believe all of the stories about the Baal Shem Tov, you're a simpleton. If you don't believe any of them, you're a heretic.
Yeah.
So,
and which one should you believe is the next question. Someone's bound to have.
Certainly within Hasidism, it is considered to be much better to be a simpleton than a heretic.
Yes, I think I go for that one. I'll go for that one. But I think so. At some point, you said that you'd also, you'd experience things like speaking in tongues or something like that in your.
Never speaking in tongues. I certainly have. I mean, I certainly have felt what I would consider to be the Holy Spirit, Ruach Kodesh, manifesting itself in my life. I do believe in what's termed hashgacha pratit, which is literally individual providence, right? Individual divine providence. And I do believe God has brought me where I am. I've never had visions or anything like that. And, in Judaism, saying that something is prophecy is, you better be very careful.
Yes.
Because
yes. And I own that. I own that.
If you say something is prophecy and it is not, you have.
It's not a great place to be.
It's a very bad place to be. It's a very bad place to be. And so this is one of my arguments with Sam. I tell him, miracles prove nothing to me, not because I don't believe miracles happen, but because I believe very strongly that miracles can come from either side.
Yes.
And there, so now we kind of do have to go into what Chabad means. So the word Chabad is an acronym of the Sfirot. I'm not sure, the Kabbalistic. So there are 10 Sfirot, which
Okay.
Kabbalistically are considered characteristics of God,
Okay.
which manifest themselves. Okay.
And presumably things like Hasid, which is
Chesed, yes, is one of the Sfirot. Yes. So
right.
the
Tzaddik.
no. So tzaddik.
Okay.
So sod is considered related to the word tzaddik. Sod meaning foundation is
Okay.
but it also means yesod. Sorry, yesod. Foundation. That is one of the 10. Yes. So the three of the highest, can't say three highest, are chachma, which is usually translated as wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. That word I know.
Bina, which is usually translated as understanding, and da'at, which is usually translated as knowledge. So chachma, bina, and da'at are the three intellectual faculties, and Chabad Hasidism is known for it is named after its focus on these intellectual faculties, and the motto of Moach Sholet al Halev, the mind, the intellect must govern the heart, the emotions. And
that's very Neoplatonist, isn't it?
Yeah. As I understand Neoplatonism, certainly so. And so the Chabad manner is that, well, of course there are miracles. Of course there is such a thing as receiving messages. The question becomes, how do you discern a message that is coming from a place of holiness as opposed to something that is coming from a place of not holiness? So there's shtut, the kedusha, which literally means the folly of holiness, and shtut, the tuma, the falliness of the impurity. And preparing yourself in such a way to make sure that what is coming to you comes from a place of holiness has always been beyond my capabilities. I have never felt myself to be in such a position that I believe that a voice that I hear is necessarily coming from a good place.
That's an interesting, yes. I think as yeah, okay. It when it's happened to me, when I've had the inner voice come, first of all, I've generally been in a good place with God anyway. Not that I'm holy, not in any way, other than the righteousness that God has put into me through the blood of Christ. But being in a place of knowing that that's the right place to be at the right time. And then the urge is irresistible to speak, even though I'm not, and I think each time I've prayed in the spirit, God is make sure this is you, because I'm also quite nervous about saying something very definitively and actually being completely wrong. Praying in tongues is much easier because you have no idea what you're saying, and therefore it's not your fault if it's wrong. Yeah, that's. But I think when you, it's interesting that in is it Chabad, the weight of glory?
Kavod.
Yes, is that the weight?
So
the pressing down? No, it's different. But in the Old Testament, it talks about the weight of glory.
right. Yeah.
And I think
the word kaved. So
Kaved.
the
Yes.
difference. The
It's my
difference
bad
is
Hebrew.
only the first letter is different, and they do sound very similar in the Hebrew. And I actually never considered the relationship, because there is, any word in Hebrew which shares two letters, two of its what are called radicals, roots.
Yes, the
With
three.
another of the three, there must be some sort of connection. And just interestingly, the word bad is a strap. So just thinking about that,
binding.
yeah, that connection. But
so anyway, the weight of glory is the way that it's described in the New Testament as well. There's phrases about the weight of glory, and I think that you become the Holy Spirit weighs upon you in a way that you can't, and your choices are limited. So like you talked about becoming the chariot. You become a vessel for the Holy Spirit to use in that sense. And there was a holiness movement in the early 1900s with lots of hymns came out of it, and very much that was a theme of it, that you became emptied for Christ's sake.
One thing you can certainly take to the bank is, by their fruits you shall know them.
Yes, absolutely.
That is an ancient Jewish idea. One of my favorite.
Of course, it is.
one of my favorite things is in I believe it's 1 Samuel, might be 2 Samuel, where David encounters Saul in the cave, and he says to him, like Kemashal Hakadmoni, which translates ancient parable, right? Goes, Mi Rasha Yetzer Rasha, from the evil comes bad things, right? And it just always hit me, something that the Bible calls an ancient, it's like the ancient proverb. It's like, it's in the Bible as an ancient proverb. You can take that to the bank, right?
You can take it to the bank.
Yeah, you can take that.
Yeah.
So, and that is really the Hebrew counterpart of "by their fruits you shall know them."
Yeah.
The fruits of
it's in 1 Samuel, and I couldn't tell you where more accurately than that, but yes, I think it's 1 Samuel somewhere. And I think because he catches him twice, doesn't he? And the first time he actually upsets himself by cutting a bit off the robe off.
I believe that is the one.
The context, yeah.
Yeah.
And he realizes afterwards that perhaps he shouldn't have done that, because it was actually the Tezit, his prayer corner, that they reckon he cut off in Christian view anyway, which is quite interesting.
1 Samuel 24:13.
There we go. Yeah.
And I
wonder what the Septuagint says. So one of the things that I've
Mirashaim Yetzeresha. I always forget the exact formulation. Mirashaim, from the wicked proceeds evil.
Yes.
You were saying.
And Jesus, of course, turns it around the other way and says, "From the good proceed good." But it's quite interesting. I wonder what the Septuagint. So one of the things I've been learning, you know, that you have thoughts and you read. So I always knew that it was this Greek version of the Bible. That and most of the quotes in the New Testament are actually not directly from Hebrew, but actually from the Septuagint, which is just like, you have no idea how badly translated that was in modern terms.
Oh yes, I do. I was about to warn you. So the Septuagint properly only refers to the Greek translation of the 5 books of Moses.
Yeah.
Because the 72 who did the translation only translated the 5 books of Moses.
Yeah.
What happened was that there were random Jews translating from the Hebrew to Greek, and these got collated into Septuagints, right? They were called Septuagint, and without a doubt, they are the worst translations that I've ever been.
So I have a friend, and she's a lovely lady. Must be in her late 40s now, but when she was 16, she was our babysitter. And she is involved in Bible translation. And she is, I think, on the 2nd or 3rd run through, because they're never happy with it.
Yeah.
And she did lots of chunks of the Old Testament, but all my Bible translation friends are constantly going back to the stuff they've done 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Is it good enough? Is it, and the Septuagint, it was just like a quick dash off.
And it was by random people. We have no idea who made the translation.
But what it did was, what's interesting to me is, so I knew that, and I knew that from my Bible study. So I pointed there because that's my bookcase. Sorry, just going to quickly, bookcase.
Lovely.
I knew that. I knew that the New Testament quotations. So I've been at Bible college. The New Testament quotations didn't seem very often to sort of match what was in the Old Testament. It wasn't really. And N.T. Wright opened up a new version of that for me, in that he said, but actually what you then find is that words that are used in the Septuagint, we can then match back to the Hebrew word and then take forward into the New Testament, because that's how they were thinking. So they weren't used. So what difficulty we had was that we were taking what the Greeks thought about that word and assuming that was what it was. But actually that wasn't the case. It was actually what the Jewish people were taking that word and looking back themselves, saying, oh, but I know that, Sadik was this word in Greek, and he translated into this word in Greek and then forward into the New Testament. And that's how we could. So that to me is one of the sort of little revelations I've had from N.T. Wright.
So
it's been really helpful to me.
One of the things a lot of people don't realize, for example, the word statute in the Bible as opposed to judgment, right? In the Bible, those correlate usually to exact same words in Hebrew. So chok, the word chok, is almost always translated as statute, whereas mishpat is all translated almost always as judgment. So that's part of when I'm going through the Hebrew of Bible verses. I try to keep things the same so that someone who is looking for similar words, where the same word shows up in multiple places. But part of the problem of translation, and one of the reasons I am so anti-translation, is that within context, the same word can mean within the same sentence. I have translated the same word within the same sentence as different words. And one example I really like to give is, so have you ever heard of the sin of Enosh?
Enoch.
No, Enosh with an
Enosh.
sh at the end. Yeah. So
Is that's one of the apocryphal books?
no, 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 no.
Enosh.
Mm-mm.
No?
Enosh shows up. He was the son of Seth, and he shows up very briefly
Excuse me while I get a Bible.
in Genesis 4:26.
I'm back.
Okay, so Genesis 4:26, King James, I'll quote it. And to Seth, to him also was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So that's Genesis 4:26.
Okay, got you. Yeah.
Now, within Judaism, the sin of Enosh is something we talk about all the time. Well, what's the sin of Enosh?
To name God?
So the word began there, right? And if you look in your concordance under the Strong's roots of that word began, actually has two meanings. Can mean to begin. Well, it has several meanings. It means to begin. It means to bore a hole, and it means to profane or desecrate.
Okay. Yes, of course it does. Why not?
So, as somebody who reads it in Hebrew, the idea that Enosh desecrate, people began to desecrate the name of God is very clear. It's the exact same word, right? At that time, people began desecrated to call upon the name of the Lord. It's the same word.
So my NIV says that at that time men began to call on, but it actually has a subtext that says to proclaim. Interestingly enough.
Well, I mean, so they're doing on the word call. So
yes.
So let me
in the positive sense rather than the negative sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's translating the word huchal. So likro, yes, is call or proclaim, and it tends to be actually a good thing. But huchal, right, is Strong's 2490, to bore or pierce. And one of the meanings is pollute, defile, profane.
Yep, that would be it.
So how do you translate that? I mean, it's a double entendre of sorts. And so I don't have any problems with the translators translating it the way it is, because they're
valid,
right. But this secondary idea that because what does it mean that people started what? Seth didn't call in the name of the Lord? Of course he did.
Yeah.
Right? So Adam didn't call on the name of course he did. So what does it mean that he began to call by the name? And so what Maimonides explains is that he meant it certainly for good, but what happened was that this profaning, making words, making the name of the Lord profane, eventually led to idolatry. So the sin of Enosh in Hebrew, we refer to it as Chet Enosh, right? The mistake of Enosh was that he, with good intentions, started idolatry. And you would never get that in translation.
I think what's interesting as well about that is that just to name God is to limit him.
So that's why I do the G-D thing. You may have noticed.
Yes, I think
yeah.
to name. So Hamakom, is that the right word?
Hamakom, yes, that's
okay.
One of the ways of referring to God is literally the place, because he is the place in which everything exists. Yes, Hamakom.
Which that's interesting. That yes, because I've been told by people who are very seriously Jewish, pro-Jewish Christians that that's what you should call him, and that's fine. But naming him the place is actually really more interesting, because oikos is the Greek word for place. And so, but also in the Septuagint, oikos is used specifically to mention the temple.
Right.
So that's, to me, that begins to sort of, sorry, probably not a very Jewish way of thinking, but that's sort of an interesting thought.
So one of the verses we say in the Kedusha, which is considered a very holy place within the Bible, within the liturgy, is
that's the prayer for the dead, isn't it?
No. You're thinking of the Kaddish, which
Kaddish.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Kedusha.
Told you my Hebrew was rubbish.
Why am I not finding it? Yimlo. Now now I have to look this up because my brain is not gonna let me not.
Excuse me a second, I've got someone calling at the door.
Go right ahead. Hopefully I can find this. Oh, kitty.
Good creature.
So Baruch Kavod. So in the Kedusha, there are several verses.
Blessed be.
And one of them is Baruch Kavod Hashem Mimekomo. So blessed is the glory of God from Mimekomo, from its place, right?
Okay.
So
yeah,
this is actually considered one of the Kedusha is considered almost the climax of the services, and yeah, it's so the idea of God as place, God as a location within which all creation exists. It's very fundamental to Judaism.
Yes, he's the in Paul van der Clay terms, he is the ground of being.
Yes,
which is a great description of what we just talked about there. That's a great way of describing it.
That God one, God two thing, right? That the Abrahamic concept crashes them into each other,
yes.
Right?
Shockingly.
Yes, very shockingly, that the Arenic is agentic, that, you know, the meta divine and the divine, you know, yeah,
the ground of being, and yes, the agent and the arena, in all in one go. Blessed be. And okay. We have been going at it for an hour and a half.
We have.
You got another half hour, apparently.
I have all the time. This is an incredibly interesting discussion we're having, and just by divine providence, my appointment canceled, so I have all the time in the world.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that's your work gone as well, though, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
but so he is the ground of being. I never cease to be amazed by the divine and the way he is and how he acts in the world. And he never lets you off the hook. He doesn't work in ways that we would appreciate often. It's interesting. I was in a meeting, and we were in the spirit praying and worshiping and just having an amazing evening. It was about 12 years ago now. And someone prayed very earnestly and very in the spirit for more people to come and to experience it and to really be part of the community, because our church isn't big. Our church was probably about 30, 40 people in the building at the time. On a Sunday morning, we're 200. So we're not a big church. And in the UK, as you probably know, religion generally is at a very low ebb. And I just knew at that point, because of the way that the Spirit worked, I said to the guy, I said, it's going to come, but you're not going to like it. And that was because God doesn't do the same thing again. And he's doing the same thing, but he's doing it differently every time. If that makes sense to you.
The word chadash, right? The word new in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Is the same word as moon or month.
Okay.
Because there is a trajectory to history, right?
Yes.
There's a beginning and there is an end.
Yes.
But there is also that cycle,
cool.
Right, of renewal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting in English that the word month has lost its moon.
Yeah.
Whereas in Russian, mesets and mesets are the same thing. Yeah. Moon would be a good. Yes, he knew every morning. Great is your faithfulness.
Lahagid baboker chastecha ve'emunatcha baleilot.
Yeah.
So one of the beautiful explanations of that verse, Lahagid baboker chastecha, to give over in the morning your chesed, right, your loving kindness.
Yes.
Ve'emunatcha, and your faith in the night, right, baleilot, is because in the morning when there's light and we can see clearly, right, it's easy to see God's divine favor and kindness, right? It's in the night when you have to have that emunah, you have to have that faith, because it's dark and you cannot see the chesed. And
yes, the minor prophets were big on even in the watches of the night.
Yeah. And the Psalms.
Yeah. We had a couple other topics to discuss, which we haven't got to. But maybe they're not the right place, because I think this is Vivek, he talks about like dialogus, and I really feel that it's been very positive in this that where things meet together and go a bit further. We had I'm going to go back to my Discord, because I wrote down what I was thinking about. I will get there. Paul. Just to throw it in for you, dear old Saul of Tarsus.
So I have to explain. I do not reject things because Paul says them. That would be wrong. It is the fact that Paul says certain things which are so alien. For example, I was genuinely shocked at the idea that he says Moses received the Torah from angels.
Yeah.
That is a direct contradiction to what it says in the Torah, right? It is a direct negation of possibly the most fundamental of Jewish beliefs, right?
Absolutely.
That we stood at Sinai and were witnesses of God speaking to Moses, right? So that was, I mean, certain things he says, his little attempt at what's called a pilpul in the first half of Romans 7. It was viscerally disgusting to me.
Okay.
To see something so I mean, by numbers, very few people have had the, I would say, honor to study Talmud in a way where you feel the revelation of studying. It's called breaking your head on the Talmud, right?
Yes. Okay.
And
that's why people, yes.
and so an average Talmud course, a graduate level Talmud course, we're not talking about children, right? We'll study 12 to 20 lines of Talmud in a year. And we're talking spending 5-6 hours a day, right? Over months and months of study, right? So one line of Talmud, right? When you take a section of Talmud, and because it is very encoded, its own. The Talmud is a mnemonic.
There's so much depth to it. It
is a mnemonic, right?
Yeah.
So the text we have is a mnemonic, and so I have had the honor to break my head on a couple of pieces of Talmud, and it is so obvious to me that he is attempting to emulate the Talmudic method of discourse, right? Of explaining things through an example of, so he talks about, a husband and wife, and what the husband dies. It is so ham-handed. It is such an obvious and poor counterfeit that I was truly enraged by it.
Okay. That he wasn't rabbinic enough for you. Or not for you, but you know what I mean.
It's such a poor example of something. Imagine that you have seen a beautiful piece of artwork, and then you watch somebody draw on it with a crayon, right? It's profanity. And I mean, this happens over and over again. He says, we are not like Moses, who wore a veil to hide the dimming of the light. To compare yourself to Moses, to say I am not like Moses in a manner of condescension, I don't even know what to say to something like that. And then he calls the Torah a ministry of death.
Yeah.
To call it the curse of the Torah. This is the most divine thing I have ever experienced, is the word of God. And Torat Chaim, we call it. We call it the law of life.
Yes.
And to call it a ministry of death, honestly, it makes me want to cry. And so what can be my, I was expecting to encounter Jesus throughout the Christian Bible,
Right.
saying similar things to Paul. And I mean, it's not a small movement within Christianity. You may be aware of
and it's not a
Paul.
new one. It's ancient too. There's Marcion and people.
Well,
Marcion, of course,
Marcion was a big fan of Paul. He went the other way.
Sorry, yes, okay, the other guy. I'm yes.
But Paul, I mean, well, yeah, there were Ebionites, there were Jewish Christians, certainly in the first century, the people he calls Judaizers. So it's not a new thing, certainly. No. And frankly, if Jesus had said similar things, then I would have been able to easily write off Christianity as just, like I do Islam or Hinduism, right? It's like, you have nothing to do with my religion. But part of what has convinced me that Jesus was not a false prophet is that I see what I believe to be clear warnings by Jesus about Paul, right? Where he says, beware of false prophets, right? That you shall know them by their fruits. They are wolves in sheep's clothing, which to me very much describes Paul, because he says to the Jew, I came as a Jew, as one under the law, but I am not under the law. And to those not under the law, I came as one not under the law. So this his deception, what he says about, I am willing to do, I run to win the race. I am willing to do whatever it takes so that honestly, it sounds to me like precisely the hypocrites that Jesus says, you are willing to do anything for a convert. And when you convert them, you make them twice the thing of hell that you are. And the other thing, Jesus says, on that day, not everyone who
says, Lord, Lord.
Yeah. And did we not prophesy in my name? And then the very interesting, the Greek here, he says, and I say to you, I have never known you. Get away from me, you lawless, you doers of lawlessness.
Yes.
Right? And who is the doer of lawlessness? It's Paul. He's the one who preaches against the law. So to me, it seems very clear that Jesus directly warns us about Paul.
Okay. It is too much for me to process and come back to you. I'm not even going to try, because it's like you have spent time and thought, and I'm not denying that on that as a way of thinking. And I'm going to have to go away and think, okay, that makes sense. Not sure it's true, but it makes sense. I was
I'm not the
talking,
first person to think.
no, and you're not. I'm
Yeah.
sure you're not. No, but
Yeah.
it's yeah. It to me, Paul makes sense, and to me, Paul is obviously part of my Bible, and therefore, I'm brought up not to question, in one sense, the very nature of Paul's ministry and his word and his letters to us, because they are the word of God. But it's an interesting point of view. I'm going to have to go away and think about it. And it's interesting in that sense. I think that when you look at the life of Paul, when especially that, and I think one of the interesting things that you come to that, first of all, that whole, is an interesting, you say Torah l'chaim.
Torat Chaim, yes.
Torat Chaim, yes, because obviously the grammar is there. I'm just sewing words together, which is different. But Torat
So
Chaim,
it's a construct. In Hebrew,
yes,
there's a construct chain where two or more terms are put together, and they are supposed to describe something new, right?
Yes.
And so the word Torah in construct with the word Chaim becomes Torat Chaim, which is usually translated as the law of life. But literally, I mean, Torah literally means to guide. So the Aramaic word for Torah is actually light. In Aramaic, the Torah is called Oraita. It's called light, right? So Torat Chaim, the guidance of life, the way of life.
Isn't that interesting? Sorry, I'm going to go on a diversion for a second.
Please.
If that's the case, which it must be, I'm not going to doubt you on that. Isn't it interesting how Jesus says, "I am the light of the world"?
I have no problem with that.
No, I recognize that, but it is to me that is a fresh interpretation of that, and I'm going to enjoy that one for a while. It's like, when you get a sweet in your mouth, one of those boiled sweets, and you just suck it, and you get goodness out of it for a long time. That's going to be a pleasant one for me.
One of the things that Hasidim say is that a person who embodies the Torah, right, who knows the Torah and lives the Torah, is more, I guess the best word would be icon, an example than the actual scroll itself, because the scroll is just, it's inanimate words on inanimate parchment, whereas a teacher is the Torah,
exemplifies,
living, breathing, right? And what we started with, talking about that tzaddik.
That you lost him, that he was lost to the world and were not replaced. That is an enormous sadness. Yeah. We've had our 2 hours. we must get to a point. It's now 11 o'clock my time, so I almost must go to bed. I've got to work in the morning. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Jacob.
We have to do this again.
Yeah. I will try and think about what you think about Paul, and I'll ponder what you think about Paul, and I'll come back, I'm sure, at some point and give you some more positive views on him, I hope, anyway, because he has so much good to say, as well as maybe some of the things that you find difficult.
Anything you want to say before I stop recording?
It's been a pleasure. It really has. And I'm really grateful. And we've got some things that we're still on the little bucket list that we wrote to begin with that we need to talk about. And I'm sure we'll come back to them. Be great.